Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Adam Stritz. And if you've been following this podcast in the past, you would know that one of the overarching topics that we discuss in virtually every episode is the question of Western tradition. And I describe this as a question because the question is how we could define Western tradition, if it's possible to define it, and how we can preserve Western tradition for the future, how we can preserve the things that we have inherited from our ancestors for our descendants. And this also ties in a very important and fundamental way with the question of freedom, what it means to be free. And if we have some idea of what it means to be free, the question then is, how do we promote this? How do we achieve this? But we cannot truly understand what it means to be free if we do not truly understand where we come from, and if we do not truly understand what our Western tradition and our Christian tradition says about these things. So in today's episode of the Pioneer Podcast, I am very happy and very grateful to speak with Professor D.C. Schindler, who is a philosopher, an American philosopher, with a particular focus and emphasis on the question of freedom, coming especially from a Christian perspective. Professor Schindler has written several books, including Freedom from Reality and Politics of the Real, books that I have personally found very helpful. And I have to say, I have said this behind his back, so I can say it now for the sake of this podcast, that if we have more philosophers like D.C. Schindler talking about our Western tradition, where we come from, and how to make sense of where we come from and the world we live in, we would certainly be in a better place. So with that, let's turn to our conversation with D.C. Schindler. Well, David Schindler, thank you very much. It's a great honor to speak with you, and I'm very happy to have you on the Pioneer Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this. I'm grateful to be here.
Well, so let me start with a quote. This is something you wrote in Freedom from Reality. You wrote, "Modern liberty is, in sum, a deceptive and ultimately self-destroying illusion which cuts one off from and indeed sets on in opposition to God, the world, other people, the community as a whole, and in every analogous expression, and even oneself, so that one's inner being in its congenital blindness to the inner reality of everything else without exception is smothered by endless layers of dissemblance." Now, this is certainly a mouthful, but it, in some ways it sums up what I took from your writing. So maybe you can explain what this means and why did you reach this conclusion?
Yes. Well, you start right with the heart of the matter. That the final summation. That sounds like an exaggeration when you first hear that stream of things. It just sounds like one. I'm trying to attribute all of the world's problems to a particular conception of freedom. But of course, that comes at the end of a long discussion in which I try to unfold aspects of it. It seems to me, seen from the perspective of the various themes that I discuss in there, it's plausible. It's more plausible than it may seem from the outside. A particular conception of freedom is presupposed by pretty much everything that we do, everything that we desire, everything that we pursue, the way we organize our existence. All of that arises from a conception of freedom. Normally, it's implicit. It's not something that we are explicitly aware of all of the time, but it's implicit. But it's still influential, and it seems to me that the particular way that we conceive freedom bears on, it colors, it directs, it disposes the way we act and think. And so it really does enter into the foundations of everything. Now, that being said, I think as you suggested there already, there's a very big difference between what you might call the traditional classical conception of freedom and the modern conception of freedom. And the modern conception of freedom, as I'm sure will be unfolding here over the course of this conversation, it tends to be oppositional in its very structure. And if that's the case, if you have this conception of freedom that actually cuts you off from reality, cuts you off from other people, cuts you off from God, if that's going to filter into everything that we think and do, that's a pretty significant problem to face.
So I remember upon discovering your work the first time, I think the first thing I heard from your work was a reference in which you said something along the lines of the very core of the modern conception of freedom is a rejection of Christ or a rejection of Christianity. And at first glance, this seems like a very strong statement and perhaps an exaggeration. But reading your work, you explain why you say that. And then one of your arguments is that these different conceptions of freedom could be described as, I think you call it freedom from above as opposed to freedom from below, where the traditional and the Christian view of what it means to be free is that freedom is something that you receive from above, a recognition that we are small and that there are things out there that are much bigger than us, that are above us on the hierarchy. And the modern conception is to flip that around, to say that the individual is on top and you can decide what reality is. So if you're a Christian, that means God exists. If you're an atheist, that means he doesn't exist. If you're any other religion, that means whatever you believe, that is reality. And so is that the way, is this an accurate description?
Yes, you're right. The freedom from above, from there means has this structure of reception and gift ultimately. From the classical conception, freedom is something that we receive, and that's the case both, you might say, ontologically. It has to do with the very structure of our being and our being created, but then also you might say historically and existentially, we actually to say that freedom is a gift is something that we receive both from God and from our tradition, from the community that precedes us, from our forebears and so forth. And in the Western tradition, Christianity lies at the very heart of our tradition, and Christianity, the message of freedom is fundamental to Christianity. Of course, Christ came to set us free, to liberate our freedom. In fact, now what happens, it seems to me, is that arguably that the modern notion that privileges individual choice and puts the individual on top, as you said so clearly there, I think one can make a pretty convincing argument that the roots of that reversal of the meaning of freedom has something to do with the movement away from Christianity, the sort of break from this tradition, this desire to actually, in a way, refound our conception of human existence outside of the tradition that we've inherited and outside of the relationship to God in Christ, in the church, that comes with that. And once you refound it, then, of course, everything's going to change. So the fundamental reference point now becomes our own individual choice, and individual choice that's no longer rooted in and oriented by these givens that ground our existence, but they become entirely a function of our moment-to-moment choice. And that, it's interesting. Initially, that seems to give us a great deal of power, but it actually creates an extraordinary burden, places a great burden on us, and in fact, I think is arguably a form of vulnerability, impotence, and vulnerability to all sorts of manipulations. And that's something that, maybe we'll be able to discuss here too.
So here in South Africa, we've also had some very interesting debates about this balance between the individual and the community, and the place of individual choice in all of this. And I've always been on the side of the freedom for the community. But the problem with having debates like these is, that's my experience at least, is you have to take a particular side of the argument. And so from a Christian perspective and a conservative perspective, or a community perspective, there's some frustration with this idea that everything is determined by individual choice, or that individual choice is everything, as if everything around that doesn't matter. And so when you're in a debate position like this, you argue, of course, for freedom of the community, as if you are against the notion of individual choice. And the reason I'm asking this is the conservative and the Christian view is not against individual choice. It's seeing it within a bigger context. How would you explain that?
No, thank you. That's a crucially important point, because when you initially hear freedom from above versus freedom from below, it seems like you're faced with this alternative. You're either the individual is entirely subordinate to the tradition and the community, or the reverse is the case, and everything is subordinated to the individual. In fact, it's a much more subtle point. A proper understanding of freedom as gift actually fully includes individual choice. In fact, arguably, it has a much more profound and central position for individual choice. It's just a notion of choice that is fully rooted in and given substance by these real goods that are given to it. The reverse, so it includes individual choice. Absolutely. The reverse is when we start with individual choice. In fact, we end up, precisely because it's so fully detached from anything substantial, and because it's so fully uprooted, it becomes completely vulnerable to outside influences. So ironically, you end up being more fully controlled by, you might say, the community or these sort of powers that are no longer liberating but are now genuinely coercive. So in fact, it's not a choice between community or individual choice. It's actually a choice between community and individual choice in the proper sense on the one hand, and neither on the other hand, the illusion of both.
So if I were to play devil's advocate, perhaps more than just figuratively speaking, and I were to say to you that the very core or essence of the modern conception of freedom, or the liberal or individualistic conception of freedom, is the Christian tradition. Is Christ coming, talking about individual responsibility, about your individual relationship with God, the messages that we see with Paul, and he's bringing the gospel to all the nations. Even St. Augustine talking about, he mentions in the Confessions, that he looked for the answer everywhere on the outside, but he couldn't find it, and eventually he found the truth inside. So it has a very individualistic ring to it. What would your response be to a claim like this?
That the question is not whether the individual is important. The question is how we conceive of the individual. So we do want to give a certain primacy to the individual. Primacy might not be the best word. A sort of centrality to the individual. But we understand that the individual actually exists always only within relationships to others. And so the very identity of the individual comes in relation to God, in relation to community, and so forth. So if the individual is understood as presupposing those relationships, then foregrounding the individual also foregrounds those relationships. So the main question is not what we emphasize more. The main question is the logic and the structure of how we understand the reality that we are talking about. Is the individual defined by relationships in a fundamental way, or is the individual self-defining and detached from all relationships? And it seems to me, you look at somebody like St. Augustine, who many people will point to as having, in a certain sense, discovered subjectivity, discovered the uniqueness of the individual person. The idea that someone at this time period would write Confessions, a story of his own life, but such a modern conception in a way. The fact that someone in the ancient world would do something like that just seems striking. So people think of him as a proto-modern, and I think that misunderstands the point that I'm making, because Augustine, there's no question, but he begins the Confessions by saying that God is more interior to me than I am to myself. In a way, everything could be drawn out of just that one principle, that one point. If that's the individual, then there's no danger in giving the individual some emphasis.
Yes, and it aligns once again the I think you used the word, the centrality of the individual, but within context of creation, tradition, and so forth. I want to ask you something that I've found very intriguing as an Afrikaner in South Africa and not as an American, is the discussion or the views you have about the founding fathers or the founding of America and the Declaration of Independence. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'll explain it the way I understood it, and then you can correct me. You talk especially about the inclusion of the words the God of nature. And you say something along the lines of that, upon first glance, this sounds like something that should indeed be included because God is the God of nature. But if you frame it in a particular way, it creates the impression, perhaps deliberately so, that there's a reference to the God of nature which is vague enough for anyone to regard that as a reference to their God. So the approach thereof is that it's a reference to God as an idea, and regardless, or you can then choose, depending on which God you believe in, that would be the God that you are talking about. And there's this sort of reminds me a bit about the South African national anthem, which is also, it's a song called Nkosi Sikelel, which is a prayer, but it's deliberately written and approached in such a way that all religions, anyone can sing it, and the religion that you are in determines what the meaning of the song is. And your take on this, with the Declaration of Independence and so forth, is that what this effectively says is this is a way of saying that the individual decides what reality is, as opposed to reality determining the scope within which the individual operates. Is this more or less correct?
That is exactly, and I guess the way to think about this is the point that we've been discussing so far. What is the fundamental reference point, the fundamental starting point? Do I start with a reality that is given to me, or do I start with my own? The only reality being my choice and my power, my willpower. In a way, that's the decisive question. Now, if that's the decisive question, it makes all the difference in the world. The way we think of God actually is crucial here, because God, of course, is the most fundamental reality, and so it becomes, you might say, that the fundamental test case. In the case of the ultimate reality, do we think of that ultimate reality as something given that precedes and makes sense of my choices, or as something as an option that is entirely measured by and determined by my choice? That's sort of the fundamental question. And once you make the decision there, it's going to affect everything else. Now, it seems to me that the political problem of religious diversity, of course, these sorts of things need to be addressed, and one needs to be very careful about how one conceives those things. But setting that aside for just a moment, if one, with a view to try to in a way accommodate a certain kind of religious diversity, one makes a positive and official and institutionalized and authoritative decision that the ultimate reality is an option. God is generic, and people can fill in the God that they want. That's going to affect the way we understand religious freedom, the way we understand religion, and that's going to, in a way, predetermine the kinds of religion that we can recognize. By contrast, if we begin with the tradition that we in fact inherit, and that's there's a kind of particularity there that's inescapable. One tradition is going to be distinct from another, and we can't we have to, in a way, recognize and acknowledge and affirm that as determinative. That's going to create a very different sense of religious freedom. One would then have to draw on the particular truths of the Christian tradition, in this case, to accommodate, to be respectful of others, rather than trying to safeguard, in a way, that kind of respect by stepping outside of any and every tradition into this area of kind of pure potency, pure possibility, pure options. I'm sorry that was a bit abstract, but if you want to follow up with some questions, maybe we can clarify.
That's well, I want to ask you this. So we've been talking now about reality and understanding reality within the context of God and reality as a gift, but the counter argument, or the modern argument, or you could even say the atheist argument, is in some ways the same. It is that they are actually the ones who have discovered reality, and that the religious argument or the classical argument is, they have all these ways of describing it. It's an illusion, or all of these things. So the actual way of discovering reality is through science. And in as far as we keep holding on to tradition and faith and so forth, we're actually preventing the discovery of reality because we're standing in the way of science. What would your response be to that claim?
Yes, yeah, that's an important question. It's a big question. I think in a way we are starting to see that objection may have been more plausible 50 years ago. It seems to me it's becoming more obviously problematic now. Just think about, you might say, the debates. I don't know how things are going in your country, but in our country, this question about follow the science, people say, and you realize that can mean an infinite number of things, actually. And by following the science, one can come to completely opposed conclusions. So science itself doesn't seem to be, in fact, able to what you recognize, and this is an argument I've actually been making lately, is that when you take science outside of an authoritative context, in fact, it becomes itself vulnerable to extra scientific forces, and it becomes just as much a matter of manipulation as other things. So science then, politics in a way refers to science, try to justify itself, and then science isn't determined by politics. And so you get this very strange dialectic of science reduced to politics, politics reduced to science, and you end up with a kind of confusion. And it seems to me that the only real way out of that is to recover a traditional authoritative context within which science makes sense. Now, one can also then move the conversation to a more direct epistemological or ontological level. I don't know that we want to do that in this context, but one can talk about the nature of scientific experience with respect to metaphysical assumptions, and I think in unfolding those, you reinforce the point that I'm trying to make.
Yes, well, maybe we can touch on some of that, because there are some aspects of this discussion within you could say the atheist argument, or the scientific argument, if I can frame it in that context for now, that come to the fore, and that once this comes to the fore, the answer is usually we cannot explain it. Things like consciousness, like transcendental experience, and so we have many of these new atheists. I'm thinking of people like Sam Harris and so forth, who have a very strong proclivity to talk about psychedelics and drugs and these type of things because of the spiritual experience that you experience from these things. And so it seems that even if we go down the science route and we detach it from faith and from the transcendental, ironically we end up coming back to the transcendental once again.
Yes, but in a sort of inverted way. I mean, that's, the various things that we've been talking about, that we can never get rid of them. We either acknowledge them in their truth, or we invert them and bring them back in a sort of problematic, and I like to call it diabolical, kind of diabolical form, which is a kind of a substitute. So we can't get rid of the transcendental. We can't get rid of faith. All we can do is reinterpret faith in ways that are no longer really liberating, or reinterpreting the transcendental. So you're exactly right. These things are inescapable, and they will come back to haunt us, or they will liberate us.
So I've asked myself a question which I try to answer, and I'd be very curious to hear your answer to this. And the question is, where did this begin? Where did this birth, or this idea of the modern conception of freedom, where does it come from? And the best answer I could achieve or reach is that it would be a gross oversimplification to point to one particular point in history. Whether we're talking about, whether we're talking about Descartes or Machiavelli or the nominalists, but something that I think is really important is something that you write about, is John Locke's the way in which John Locke rewrote the definition of freedom. Literally going back into his previous notes and changed the definition of freedom. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I think that's quite important.
Yeah, this question, just to make a comment first about your first point, this question of trying to find the cause, it's interesting. A colleague once made this observation to me, and it's really transformed the way I think about this. Typically, we look for, you might say, the efficient cause of these problems, and that's actually, as interesting as that might be, that's not actually as important as asking the formal cause. And the formal cause has to do with the nature of the problem, as opposed to just its source in history. The source, then, trying to ask where it arose, that takes on a different form if you see that the point of that is to illuminate its nature rather than just find out who to blame. So that being said, in the book that you mentioned, it seemed to me I took Locke as not necessarily the one who started all the problems. I mean, not at all. One can find all sorts of prior and posterior influences that play very important roles. The point of Locke for me is that he's represents the form of the problem. He's kind of a paradigm of the problem. And when you look at him in that respect, it actually becomes incredibly illuminating. The point that you make, I mean, it's in a way, it's such a beautiful historical accident. It seems to me if Plato were around, these sorts of historical accidents become a beautiful kind of philosophical images or parables, as it were. But what's so interesting about Locke is in the book, the Essay on Human Understanding, where he lays out his theory of freedom, it underwent several editions, and the major changes that he made had to do with one particular chapter, which is on the question of the nature of power. And at the heart of that chapter was the question of freedom. And that's the one that he really worked on and made significant changes over time, even though he actually I ultimately identified that everything is hanging on a particular word, which I can say a word about in just a moment. But it's fascinating because one can see, you might say, the modern conception of freedom being born here in these revisions. In his earlier version, he said what most determines our actions is the highest good as we perceive it, and that's something that would be a more traditional view. In the final version, he says that what determines our actions is ourself. Basically, it's the mind that determines the will, but both of them are functions of human agency. So, he struggled to that, and it's actually quite illuminating to watch this happen and then think through the implications.
So, taking this event, this historical event that was very, you could say, insignificant when it happened, it was just John Locke sitting in his study room making some notes. But what are the consequences of an event like this, of Locke going back and at least, obviously not in terms of the whole worldview, but in terms of his worldview and the consequences of actually changing what it means to be free, what freedom means? How does this play out then?
Yeah. So I mean, the word that he confesses to a friend that was really the decisive thing. He had initially talked about freedom, our will being directed to things, and he changed that to actions. And what's so interesting is there's something very subtle there. If you say the will is directed to things, you have this recognition that the will is rooted in reality. It's determined in relation to reality.
Things outside of us.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's able to make contact with something outside of ourselves. Whereas if you think of the will as he says, terminating it in our actions, then in a way our will never reaches reality. It never reaches anything outside of ourselves. It just the will is entirely, in a way, subjective, contained within the subject, and the connection to the world then becomes something accidental. We collide with something outside of ourselves, and that the implications are just enormous. Is our fundamental identity defined in relation to the realities of the world, or is it atomistic? Is it contained in itself, trapped in itself? David Hume, not long after, said that we never take a step outside of ourselves, and he was operating with the very similar sense of what the will is and what freedom is and what the mind is ultimately.
Yes, and I think one way to look at it also is the comparison of Locke's tabula rasa approach of us being a blank paper. You are born as a blank sheet of paper, and then you get written on, as opposed to, or you fill in your piece of paper, as opposed to the Aristotelian view that says that it's more akin to a wax tablet. And there's a difference. A wax tablet is something that exists, and you get carved into. How would you then? What would the difference be then between? We can talk about the Christian view, and we have spoken about this for a while, but the Aristotelian idea of freedom as opposed to the Lockean idea, or the classical Western idea as opposed to the modern idea.
I think the Aristotelian was assumed into the Christian tradition and the classical Christian tradition, and there's a key phrase that Aquinas loved. Aristotle, and this is one of the more Platonic moments. This is where you really see a connection between Plato and Aristotle, as opposed to, a distinction between them. Aristotle said that the soul is, in a certain sense, all things. The soul is itself, in a certain sense, all things. The soul is all things. So what does that mean? That means that think about the intimacy that suggests between the soul and the reality outside. These aren't just foreign objects that stand over against me as a pure subject that I can only interact in a kind of superficial way with. But when I encounter things in the world, I'm actually simultaneously coming to understand something about myself, and I'm coming to understand something about the deep inner reality of things. There's a communion there at the heart of it. And the wax tablet, it's kind of interesting. When you write on it, you're actually taking something away rather than putting something into it. It suggests that there's a fullness of reality. There's already a kind of a deep connection with reality that's presupposed. Whereas a blank sheet of paper that you write on, it's empty. It's absolutely empty. So for Locke, the soul is not, in any respect, identical to reality or connected to reality. It's always detached. And along those lines, it's very interesting. He says, when he asks what it means to know and what truth is, he actually defines truth not in the mind's connection to reality, which is the classical tradition, but instead he defines it as a consistent interrelationship among ideas. So it's now simply a matter of the mind's relationship to itself, you might say, rather than its relationship to reality. So you see this increasing definition of the self as something totally self-contained, as a kind of a pure subjectivity that then, faces this great problem that Descartes raised is, how do we get from inside ourselves into the world? Whereas the classical tradition never faced that problem because it was always already involved in things.
Yes, and I think this comes back to the point you make about freedom from above as opposed to freedom from below. So the Bible has many references to the fact that we are small, that we can be compared to a little worm, and all of these things, that human beings are very small compared to God and nature. But that's also even before Rome and Athens and Jerusalem became reconciled, you could say that was the Roman view. Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and others wrote about this, and the Greeks wrote about this. The idea that it's a recognition of the fact that the world or the cosmos is very big, that that we are very small, but also that it is a gift, that it is something that is given to us, and that we have to be grateful for it. And that's why gratitude has been one of the founding ideas of the Christian view, but Western civilization. And the new idea says, no, you are in control. You determine what reality is. And so it also takes away, it detaches freedom from gratitude in a very fundamental way.
That's right. Right. The sense of our being small and connected to something that's larger than ourselves, in one sense, that seems like it's humiliating and potentially dangerous and threatening. But in fact, if you recognize the reality that is greater than us is the reality of God, who has given himself without remainder in his Son and communicated to the church and so forth, then you see that the model of humility is Mary, who says yes to God, and precisely in that saying yes and humbling herself, she becomes the most glorious creature, higher than kings, as it were. And that's there you see there's no opposition between being small and being great. And you're absolutely right. Gratitude is at the core of that. I think we even just existentially, psychologically, it's not hard to see that some of the most beautiful experiences of freedom that we have are very often connected with the sense of gratitude. And if one is feeling sort of smothered by circumstances or under stress, to take a moment to be grateful for, the traditional count one's blessings, that seems like a cliche, but there's something really profound about that reorients and gets perspective. You recover a sense of freedom, actually, in recalling the things that you have to be grateful for.
So there's something else I would like to get your view on. It's something that we've been discussing quite a bit, and it's about the idea of the West and what is the West. Because we believe, and we've argued this on this podcast, and many of my guests on this podcast have argued along these lines, that especially in times like the times that we are in now, it's very important to rediscover the Western tradition, to rediscover what it means to be Western. But in pursuit of this, we have found that a lot of people today, a lot of what you might describe as Westerners, are annoyed or frustrated or even angry when they hear references to the West. Because when they think about the West today, they think about a whole lot of things that are not necessarily the classical Western tradition. So the question then is, has the West become something else? Is it worth still trying to pursue the idea of being Western, or has the West morphed or developed into something that it wasn't, and that it's not worth trying to pursue anymore? Where do you see yourself in this argument?
That's a really great question, really interesting question. I would first make reference to the author, you probably know, Remy Brague, the French philosopher. He has this beautiful little book that's been translated into many different languages. In English, it's called The Eccentric Culture, I believe. The more literal translation of the French, it's La Voie Romaine, the Roman way, but that title was taken in English already, a famous book by Ib Hamilton. In any event, what he argues in this book, it's interesting. He's trying to define what the West is and what Europe is, and he's an incredibly erudite and well-educated man. He really knows the ancient tradition and is fluent in all the languages. He interprets the West as he coins this term secondarity. The heart of the reason he calls it, he says, the Roman way is, he points out that the Romans are defined culturally speaking by the Greeks. So the best thing that the Romans have, they've received from a culture outside of themselves. And he takes that principle as what defines the West is that it receives what's best about itself from what is other. What's interesting about that is that you actually, he traces this through. This is a very Christian notion. That the New Testament emerges out of the Old Testament, and even Christ receives himself from the Father. This is I don't know that this was his strategy, but you see, there's a direct connection between what defines the West and what defines Christianity. But what's interesting about that argument is it's non-exclusive. It's that it's not that the West defines itself in a way in exclusion to and in contrast to, in opposition to other cultures, but as precisely a recipient, you might say, of what's best in other cultures. Now, that's the classical tradition. The really interesting question that I think touches on a lot of the concerns that you're raising is that when we think of the modern West, we and especially in certain contexts, we think of colonialism, this sort of the pursuit of empire and control and so forth, and I think arguably, if you historically speaking, those impulses arose precisely when the classical tradition was being rejected, and the church understood as the Catholic in both the big C and little c sense of continuity with the tradition. When that was being set aside, it was precisely in that moment that these more sort of militaristic ventures, the notion of the nation state as a kind of centralized human institution with global ambitions and so forth. That's something that I would say doesn't represent the West as it does in a lot of people's consciousness. I think postmodern philosophy, when it rejects the West, it rejects actually the modern West. And I think a much saner view recognizes that these, the Enlightenment and so forth, these aren't the flourishing of the West, but they're actually a departure from what was deepest in the West. So I think one can be sympathetic with a lot of the objections that are raised against certain currents in European thought and modern European thought in particular. without having that imply a complete rejection of the Western tradition simply. I mean, quite to the contrary, as I said, I think one can be most critical of these trends from the perspective of the proper Western tradition.
So earlier this year, I was in Serbia, on the Serbian border between Serbia and Hungary, this notorious border where the fence was built when the immigration crisis happened. And I had a conversation there with a Calvinist pastor who made a very interesting remark that I've thought about quite a bit after that. It was about the immigration crisis in Europe and also the secularization of Europe. And the remark was more or less that when immigrants go to Europe today from the Middle East or Africa or wherever, they move into a void because of the secularization and so forth. So the concern is there's not much for them to assimilate with, because a lot of the Christian tradition of the West and of Europe has been eroded to such an extent that if you arrive there, if you immigrate there, it's not something that you take up. But a void by nature is something that has to be filled, and so this void is then filled with other things. And these could be secular ideas, but it could also then be other religions. It could be Islam, and we see it very practically with churches being converted into mosques, but not just that, also other ideologies that are sort of taking the place of religion and even science in some cases, presented as something that has to be placed instead of religion. How do you see that?
I think that's a very perceptive observation, and that just underscores the point that secularization in a way is itself, it doesn't represent the West as it does in the mind of so many from the Islam and so forth, thinks and also interestingly from Russian from I know some political philosophers that are very interested in the Eastern tradition of the church and how that has informed politics, and they tend to identify the secularism with the West, and I think it's absolutely crucial to say that secularism, as you've described it, is itself an abandonment of the Western tradition, and in that sense, it's as you described so beautifully there, it's actually going to create all sorts of problems because, as you say, we can't get rid of religion and tradition and faith and so forth. We're just going to create these substitutes for them in ways that they don't actually genuinely fulfill the role that they are meant to have, and end up then sort of multiplying problems. The very solution is proposed solution is a form of the problem, kind of reinforcement of the problem.
Another point that we've noticed, again from a South African or Afrikaner perspective, that when we talk about terms such as being right-wing and being conservative, to us there's quite an important difference between those terms, but we have noticed that in much of America and much of Europe, those two terms are largely regarded as synonymous. And the reason I mention this is, for us, and maybe this is an oversimplification, to be right-wing is more or less to be defined by what you are against, or if you're against leftist ideas, that makes you right-wing or something along those lines. And to be conservative is to be more defined by what it is that you wish to preserve. And so a concern for us looking at Europe and the USA especially is that it does seem that conservatism has been eroded to such an extent that what we have left now is only the idea of being right-wing. And I'm exaggerating, but do you see a difference between these two terms? Are you concerned that people are only right-wing but not conservative anymore, or how would you describe this?
You put it beautifully, and I don't know if I mean you're exactly right. In fact, there have been some people that argue that the right wing is not conservative at all. If you think of the fundamental meaning of conservatism, if it's if conservative means precisely is defined by the things that it saves and holds on to and receives, the right wing typically is increasingly betrays that in all sorts of ways. I mean, very obvious sense is the connection between right-wing politics and a certain libertarian politics. It seems to me that the libertarianism is just as against the conservative principles as the left-wing policies are. So one way to think about this is something that Alistair MacIntyre, the great philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, observed many years ago. That now I'm speaking here again in just specifically the American context, and it'd be interesting to hear how this might bear on the situation in South Africa. But in America, he said there are no conservatives. Everyone is liberal in terms of the founding principles. And within liberalism, you have progressive liberals, you have liberal liberals, you have conservative liberals, but everybody is liberal. There's not a real alternative to liberalism. I think the real alternative to liberalism is conservatism, which has it's something that actually transcends the divide, and it transcends the divide because the divide arose when the tradition was abandoned, when we left actually this older tradition, and the rise of the nation state. I mean, that's the language of left and right began with the French Revolution. So these notions really have historical context that ought to be recalled.
Yes, so I would say from our perspective, South Africa has had a very tumultuous history over the last century, and there were some really, horrible things happening politically, and especially us as the Afrikaner people were very much targeted as a result of policy ideas in the 20th century, the apartheid system and so forth. And I think our experience is we were very much after the 1990s, when the Berlin Wall fell, everyone believed communism was defeated and the end of history has arrived. And so we got this, it was celebrated back then as the most liberal, most democratic, or most modern constitution in the world, which is still in place today. But the South Africa is a very good example of the difference between de jure and de facto reality, once again. So we always say if you bring two aliens or Martians to South Africa to spend a day in the country, and one were to read the text of the Constitution and then go back, and the other one were to walk around in the suburbs and then go back, and they have to report back, you would have two completely different stories, because the one would explain the de jure reality and the other one would explain the de facto reality, which are in many ways very contradictory. But I think one thing that I can say about the Afrikaner people, about my own people, that we are very grateful for is we've very much been, beaten into submission politically and all of that. But I think we've reached a point now where we are much more defined, and especially our institutions are much more defined by its conservatism than by being right-wing, than by being reactionary to what the government is doing. But the focus is very much on preserving the culture and tradition that we have built. And what concerns us when we speak with our friends in America and Europe especially is that oftentimes we find that the emphasis is not so much on preserving your unique heritage and identity and religion and so forth. The emphasis is very much on how are we going to fight the left? How are we going to beat the left? And that might be important, but that's at best it can be secondary.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. I used to joke about America was founded in the 18th century, and that was just a lousy time to found a country. And the point being that the intellectual the spiritual horizon at that time ended up sort of baking into the founding certain principles that I think we are suffering the consequence of increasingly. And it'd be interesting to ask whether the sort of refounding of the political scene in South Africa, happened also at a bad time where the spiritual horizon was not propitious for the recovery of the most fruitful principles in the tradition. And we're in a moment now. You might say we're in the post-liberal moment, and I know in the American scene, this recognition of the failure of liberalism has become so mainstream in a way that just would have been unthinkable even a couple of decades ago. It's becoming obvious to everyone that we need to rethink things fundamental way. And if that is the case, that we're entering a kind of a post-liberal moment, it's that it seems to me that raises a question about a constitution that presents itself as being the most liberal, the most modern. It's sort of a regrettable time for that. If you see what I'm saying, the point is we can never really address these fundamental human questions without drawing on the whole of the tradition in its most, drawing on the deepest and most fruitful resources of the tradition. Until we do that, we're going to just repeat versions of the problem over and over and over again.
So I have two more questions, and this ties in very well with the remark you just said. Recently, I was in Budapest at CPAC, Hungary, and there was an event, and one of the people who attended the conference, I had a conversation with. It's a lady from France, and she made a very striking remark, sort of in passing. She said that she agrees with a lot of what people are saying at this conference, but she doesn't know how to make it practical, because it sounds to her as if when we are talking about conservative ideas and so forth, as if we are trying to reverse modernity. We're trying to go back to the Middle Ages, but it's not possible to go back to the Middle Ages. So these conservative ideas are sort of nice to have philosophical conversations, but it's not really practical or tangible. What would your response be to a claim like that?
It's a good question. It's a very difficult question. I mean, the key would be to recognize that going back, ironically, is a modern move because
yes, exactly.
Tends to think of history as like a series of options, and we need to pick this option rather than that one. And I mean, that's not the way history works. That's not the way human beings work. There is no way to go back, and that doesn't. Tradition moves forward. Now, to say a tradition moves forward doesn't mean that a certain kind of progressive politics is the end of history. Tradition moves forward, but it stays the same in moving forward. There remain the fundamental principles. So what I would say is that, in a certain sense, there's something very practical about this, because it's recovering principles that cannot but always be present and available in a certain respect. We just recognize that these principles evolve and come to analogous expressions in the future. So Robert Spemann once said very beautifully that the point isn't to reject modernity. The point is to interpret modernity against itself, which is to say to take the things that have emerged in the modern era and reconnect them to the vine, you might say, of the tradition, so that they can properly bear fruit. And that creates certain tensions, because modernity defines itself so often in opposition to the tradition. But in principle, that's possible. So it's not about going backwards. It's about going forward in a much more fruitful way. Now, I'm speaking in generalities, and of course, in this context, we can only really speak in generalities. But it seems to me that this would have some very practical implications that could be discerned through prudence.
Yes. And so this brings me to the last question, and it's sort of a broader question about where do we go from here, but with reference to one of our Afrikaner philosophers, a person named N.P. van Wyk Lowe. We've often referenced him on this podcast. He wrote a book called Liberal Nationalism. I think it was in the 1930s or 50s. And the argument he makes is, first and foremost, that if the liberal argument is, with reference to Evelyn Beatrice Hall, that line that I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say that, then that argument should also be applied to nations and communities. So if you disagree with what some community or some nation says, you should also wish for them to preserve their own uniqueness. But then he goes on to talk about tradition and the value of tradition, and he says there are three ways of thinking about tradition. The one is living inside tradition, which he's critical of. And so he says living inside tradition implies that we don't have our own senses, that we don't have unique circumstances today, and that answers have already been discovered to all the questions, or that we don't need to apply our minds. That, as opposed to living outside of tradition, as if no one before has given thought to anything, and we can just answer everything for ourselves. And then he says the balance is what he calls living from tradition. So that is being in your tradition, being rooted in your tradition, and then finding the wisdom that you can take from tradition, but also recognizing that we live in unique times and unique circumstances. So I'd like to hear your views on that sort of approach, but then also if we say we don't want to reverse modernity, but we live in a particular context, how do we then go forward in saying that we need to, that we wish to return in a certain sense, at least to Christ as the answer and to our Western tradition as the answer? What is this balancing act then?
It's very complex. Living from the tradition, the proper image might be, fruit on a tree if the fruit were simply inside the tree, that it wouldn't really be fruit, and there would be a kind of a smothering of fruit, and the fruit, you might say, lives from the tree, and that might be the proper image, but I would be careful in the sense that I wouldn't want to think of ourselves as, some people say that the point of the tradition is we should look over the past and choose the best. That the point is that we pick out the great achievements of the past and continue those forward. Now, there's a certain truth to that, but that there's, in a very subtle way, one is placing oneself as the kind of criterion and the judge of what counts as best, and in a way that can actually be a subtle way of stepping outside of the tradition and measuring it against some sort of subjective.
It's the flipping of the hierarchy again, as we discussed.
That's exactly right. It's another version of that. One has to recognize that even one's judgment arises through what one's received through the tradition. So the key is, I think, instead of coming up with a program of like, how do we answer these questions, I think the best way to think about it, maybe the most concrete way to think about it, is recovering and strengthening what's best in us and what's best in our tradition, and recovering the vitality and the roots of the very thing that make us who we are, and then act naturally. In a way, once we have a very strong and confident sense of who we are, we're actually we're in a better position to be respectful of others. I mean, we see this psychologically speaking, but I think politically it's also the case that the very practical decisions become natural once we've recovered a proper sense of identity. So that would be a more kind of organic way of approaching the question.
Well, thank you, DC Schindler. This was a very wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. There's much more that we can talk about, and there's much more, of course, in your books, which I really enjoyed. So I would encourage our viewers or listeners to look you up, to get to find your. I was able to order your books on Amazon, and it was delivered here in South Africa. So I would really encourage people to read that. And thank you very much for the contribution that you are making. It was great to speak to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a privilege to take part in this conversation, and I look forward to some future conversations, perhaps. But good luck with your work, your worthy projects, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hi, I'm Adam Stritz. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.